the earliest religions in humanity have been polytheistic. Okay? And the gods themselves were very much like humans. So think of the Greeks, okay? Zeus, Athena, Hera. Okay? It was a polytheistic society, and they were very much like humans. But over time, this polytheism became monotheistic, and it became abstract, okay? The idea of God was so much removed from us. And the benefit of that is that you can have more people believing in one God. And it motivates you to work harder, okay? Because it's just an abstract concept. And because of abstraction, we develop new ideas. For example, money, okay? So rather than have war, religion, and civilization as the structure and center of our society, why not make money the structure of your society, okay? And this is what we call capitalism. And capitalism, of course, led to the Industrial Revolution, industrialism. Okay? Capitalism meant that societies were becoming wealthier and wealthier, more industrial and more industrialized. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. But there's a problem with capitalism, right? What's a problem with making capital or money at the very heart of your society?
Like people only care about making profits and not what their actions have on other people.
Exactly, okay. So the first major problem with capitalism is it's all-consuming. So as Jacques says, all capitalism cares about is the expansion and growth of capital, regardless of its effect on society, okay? Profit for the sake of growing profit. It's an all-consuming idea, which can ultimately lead to the destruction of the planet, okay? That's the first problem. What's another problem with capitalism, or the idea of having money as the heart and center of your society? Anyone? Okay. So what this means is that money likes to consolidate itself. Okay, consolidating. Okay, meaning that so the example is, let's just say that each of us had $1 million, right? What's the fastest way for us to grow our money? If we put it together, right? And then we can go invest it. Okay? So in other words, if you just let capitalism do whatever it wants to infinity, what happens is that you exactly have one person with all the money. Okay? Does that make sense? Because that's the fastest way to grow money, by consolidating it. Okay? So that's problematic. What else is wrong with capitalism or money? Okay. So another problem is the idea of alienating or dehumanizing. Okay? What does this mean? Capital alienates and dehumanizes. What does that mean? Exactly, okay. You as a person cease to be human, right? To be a human is to be a complex, multifaceted individual who likes to create and love. But in capitalism, you're only your production value, you're only the amount of money in your bank account, okay? Does that make sense? All right? So for all these reasons, capitalism is really bad. There are actually more reasons, okay? So Karl Marx, in his Communist Manifesto, points out all these problems of capitalism, and he proposes a solution, which is, okay, rather than make money at the heart and center of your industrial society, make the worker the heart and center of your society, okay? So he makes this argument. But what's very revolutionary or prescient about his argument is this is a natural cycle, okay? This is part of the Hegel cycle where capitalism comes along and communism will be the natural evolution of capitalism. Okay, why? Okay, so let's do the thought experiment, okay? Let's do this thought experiment where your parents have died and now you're working in a factory in order to survive. How do you feel about this? Your parents have died, there's no one to support you, so at age 16, 17, 18, you have to go off to a factory to make money for yourself. So how do you feel about this? Are you happy about this? How do you feel?
It's pretty depressing.
Depressing and lonely and
probably makes the person bitter.
yeah, exactly. Okay, you're bitter and you're depressed. Okay, you're alienated. So then, what do you do? Then what do you do? What can you do now? You're bitter, you're angry, you're depressed, you're lonely. So what do you do? Okay, you start to think about why this is the case, right? You start to have a political consciousness. Okay, what Marx calls political consciousness. From this alienation of the worker, workers will start to develop a political consciousness, right? They're like, why is this happening? Why is the government abandoning me? Why has society abandoned me? What can I do about this, okay? So then what happens? That's exactly right. You want change, right? And how do you enact change?
Try to spread your ideas.
Yes, okay. You spread your ideas and you organize, right? And when you organize, what do you realize?
You're stronger together.
Yeah, what you recognize when you start to organize is the capitalists need you to do the work, right? The capitalists own the capital and the factories, but you're the one who's actually doing the real work. So without you, the factories can't run. So as long as you're united, you can enact whatever political demands you want. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so for Marx, this is just a natural evolution of capitalism. Capitalism leads to the alienation of the working class, which will lead to their political consciousness, which will lead to their solidarity, which will lead to a political revolution. And so you can make the worker as the heart and center of your society. Okay? Does it make sense, guys? All right? Now, what's amazing about Marx is that today we say he's wrong, right? Communism happened in the Soviet Union, it happened in China, but it didn't happen in Europe and in the United States, where Marx said it would happen first because Germany was more industrialized than Russia or China. Okay? Does that make sense? That's what we say. But if you think about it deeply, okay, Marx was right. After World War II, every society, every industrial society, to some extent, adopted the ideals of communism. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, we call this socialism and not communism, but basically it adheres to the thinking of Marx, which is to make the worker the heart and center of your society. And why did they do that after World War II? Exactly, okay? Because workers create value. Okay? Money doesn't create any value. Money just creates more money. It's speculative. But the workers create value. They're productive. And therefore, you have to treat your workers properly. So in America and in Europe, workers became the heart and center of your society. And the workers, through unions, could demand political reforms. And so all of society was geared towards making the lives of the middle class, the working class, better, okay? That's why you had excellent healthcare, great public schools, cheap universities. Okay? So the 50s and 60s and 70s was basically the peak of society for the working class. But in the 80s, we start to change this. Why? Why would we want to change the system? It's a great system, right? Marx is right. Having the worker as the heart and center of your society, as the central organizing unit of your society, makes a lot more sense than having money as the heart and center, okay? But starting in the 80s, we start to go back to money. Why? Excuse me?
Like they have the production necessary for society, so they want more like.
Who wants more? Yes, exactly. Okay. So what happened in the 80s is something called the revolt of the elite. Okay? In other words, the problem with having a society based on the worker is it becomes too egalitarian, too equal, right? But if you're like the elite, you don't want equality, you want difference. You want to have power and money in your hands. Does that make sense? So the revolt of the elite happened in the 80s, and this is what we call in the United States the Reagan Revolution, okay? The Reagan Revolution. The beginning of neoliberalism, free market capitalism. And in Britain, it was called Thatcherism, okay? Margaret Thatcher, the Thatcher Revolution. And so now you need to transition away from the worker to something else, okay? Another ideology that allows the elite to amass power, okay? So just to show you how radical this revolution was. In the 1970s, okay, 1970s, if you were a CEO, the head of a company, okay, you were making on average $1 million a year. That's pretty good, right? That's really good money. And that $1 million was more than 20 times the worker. Okay? And that's pretty reasonable. Today, the average CEO in the United States makes $20 million a year. And that is 200 to 300 times more than the average worker in the company. Okay, does that make sense? So in the 80s, inequality started to explode, right? And so they were transitioning from the worker to a new organizing unit called the consumer. Okay? So they needed to destroy the working class, the middle class. And the way they did it was by introducing a new concept called the consumer, okay? So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the government promised you a good job. If you were a member of a society, if you were a citizen, I promise you a good job that you would have for the rest of your life, okay? So in the 80s, the government said, I promise you that you have low prices and a wide selection of goods. Okay, does that make sense?